Drg-Drishya Viveka. Drg-Drishya Viveka. There is a short text in the Advaita Vedanta tradition whose authorship has never been settled to anyone's satisfaction. Some scholars give it to Adi Shankaracharya, the great 8th century philosopher who reshaped the course of Indian thought. Others assign it to Bharatitirtha, a 14th century dialectician of considerable force. The honest answer is that we do not know who wrote it, and in a strange way the text does not require us to know. What we can say is that it emerged from a world in which elaborate ritual systems had multiplied beyond counting, and yet the practitioners who performed them faithfully remained, by their own admission, bound. Something was being missed. This small treatise, the Drg-Drishya Viveka, which means the discrimination between the seer and the seen, was an attempt to name what was being missed. It is a precise and economical work, and it asks the reader to do something unusual, not to learn something new, but to notice what has always already been present. With that, let us turn to the text itself. Verse 1. Forms are perceived by the eye. The eye is perceived by the mind. The mind with all its modifications is perceived by the witness, but the witness is not perceived by anything else. Verse 2. These forms are varied, blue, yellow, gross, subtle, short, long, and so forth. The eye that perceives them remains one and unchanged. Verse 3. Similarly, the modifications of the eye, such as blindness and sight, are diverse, but the mind that perceives them is one. The mind's modifications, desire, resolve, doubt, faith, lack of faith, steadiness, unsteadiness, shame, intelligence, and fear, are all perceived by the witness. Verse 4. This witness appears to undergo birth and death, happiness and sorrow, but these are properties of the subtle body reflected in the witness. The sun reflected in water appears to shake when the water moves, though the sun itself remains motionless. Verse 5. Birth, death, and all modifications belong to the subtle body. They are superimposed upon the Atman through ignorance. The witness, being pure consciousness, remains eternally unchanged. Verse 6. The subtle body is the instrument. The witness is distinct from it. Through ignorance, the properties of the instrument are attributed to the witness, just as the movements of clouds are attributed to the moon. Verse 7. Through the discrimination between seer and seen, one should withdraw from identification with body and senses. What remains as the eternal witness is the self, pure consciousness. Verse 8. The individual self and Brahman are one, like space enclosed in a jar and infinite space. When the jar breaks, the space within merges with the space without, revealing their eternal unity. Now the text opens into something wider. It has established the basic discrimination, seer and seen, witness and witnessed, and it has given us the jar space image to point toward the identity of the individual and the infinite. From here, the text turns its attention to the three bodies, then the 5 sheaths, and then the specific means by which a prepared seeker can rest stably in what has been recognized. These middle sections are essential to the architecture of the whole work, and we should not pass over them. Verse 9. The three bodies are gross, subtle, and causal. The gross body is made of the 5 elements. The subtle body consists of the 5 vital airs, the 5 organs of perception, the 5 organs of action, and the fourfold inner instrument of mind, intellect, ego, and memory. The causal body is the beginningless ignorance that is the seed of both the others. Verse 10. The Atman is other than these 3 bodies. It is the pure witness of them all. Just as a lamp illuminates a room while itself remaining untouched by what is illuminated, the Atman illuminates the 3 bodies while remaining wholly apart from their conditions. Verse 11. Enveloping the Atman are 5 sheaths, like the successive layers of a scabbard around a blade. The first is the sheath of food, the gross physical body, which is born from food, sustained by food, and returns to food. One who identifies solely with this sheath mistakes the container for the contents. Verse 12. The second is the sheath of the vital breath. The pranic force that animates the body moves through it as the 5 vital airs and gives it the appearance of life. This sheath is subtler than the body of food, but is no less an object of perception, no less something seen rather than the seer. Verse 13. The third is the sheath of mind, the layer of feeling, desire, and automatic reaction. Most people who look inward for the first time encounter this sheath and mistake it for the self, because it feels intimate and immediate. But the mind too is perceived. It too rises and falls. It too is an object. Verse 14. The fourth is the sheath of intellect, the discriminating faculty, the capacity for judgment and discernment. This is closer still to the Atman, and it can easily be mistaken for it, especially by those engaged in careful philosophical inquiry. But even the intellect is witnessed. Even the act of discrimination is known by something deeper than discrimination. Verse 15. The fifth is the sheath of bliss, the Anandamya kosha, which corresponds to the causal body and is experienced most readily in deep sleep and in certain states of meditation. It seems of all the sheaths the most like the self, because it is characterized by a kind of contentless happiness. But it is still a sheath. Bliss too is perceived. The witness of bliss is not bliss itself. It is pure awareness, which is the Atman. Verse 16. The Atman is not the gross body, for it existed before the body and will remain after it dissolves. It is not the subtle body, for the subtle body is an aggregate of instruments. It is not the causal body, for the causal body is ignorance, and the Atman is the very light by which ignorance is seen and dissolved. Verse 17. The Atman is pure existence, pure consciousness, pure joy, not as qualities that belong to it, the way blueness belongs to a flower, but as its very nature. Existence is not something the Atman has. The Atman is existence. Consciousness is not something the Atman produces. The Atman is consciousness. Joy is not something the Atman experiences. The Atman is joy. Verse 18. Just as many lamps may be lit from one flame, and each lamp illumines its own room without diminishing the original flame, so Brahman appears to have become many individual selves without suffering any division or diminishment. Verse 19. Brahman alone exists. The world of name and form is Brahman appearing through the limiting adjunct of Maya, just as the one formless sky appears differently when seen through a blue glass or a red one. The glass tints the appearance, it does not change the sky. Verse 20. The individual self, the jiva, is Brahman conditioned by the limiting adjunct of the inner instrument. Remove the limiting adjunct through knowledge, and the jiva is seen to have always been Brahman. There is no separate jiva to be liberated. There is only the recognition of what was never bound. Verse 21. The relationship between Brahman and the world is neither one of identity nor of complete difference. Brahman is not reducible to the world, and the world is not something entirely other than Brahman. The traditional example, the ocean and its waves. The waves are real as waves. They are not separate from the ocean as substance, and yet they are not the totality of the ocean. Verse 22. The scriptures employ three principal methods to point to this relationship. The method of superimposition and subsequent retraction, Adhiropa and Apavada, first attributes qualities to Brahman in order to give the mind a foothold, then systematically withdraws those qualities until what remains is beyond all attribution. This is not contradiction. It is the method of a teacher who meets the student where the student stands. Verse 23. Just as a mirage appears as water to the eye, but yields no water when approached, so the appearance of the world as independently real yields, on investigation, only Brahman. The world does not disappear, its presumed independence does. Verse 24. The consciousness that pervades the waking state, the dream state, and the deep sleep state is one and the same. In waking, it illuminates gross objects. In dream, it illuminates subtle projections. In deep sleep, it illuminates nothing, and yet something knows that nothing was known. That knowing something is Turiya, the fourth, which is not a fourth state, but the ground of the other three. Verse 25. The Atman is Turiya. It is not waking, not dreaming, not the blankness of deep sleep. It is the invariant awareness within which all three states appear and from which they borrow their reality. Verse 26. Brahman is described by the great sayings of the Upanishads. Consciousness is Brahman, I am Brahman, that thou art. All of this is indeed Brahman. These are not four separate doctrines. They are four windows opening onto the same interior. Verse 27. Of these great sayings, the saying that thou art Tat Tvam Asi is particularly suited to direct instruction because it brings the infinite and the individual into direct apposition. That which is Brahman, the ground of all existence. Thou which is the student standing before the teacher. Art not shall become, not could be with sufficient effort, but are, now, always. Verse 28. The word thou in that thou art does not refer to the body, the vital breath, the mind, the intellect, or the ego. These are the seen, and they are covered by the word art only when the word is understood superficially. Properly understood, thou refers to the pure witness, the awareness that has been present throughout this entire inquiry. Verse 29. Equally, the word that does not refer to Brahman as a being elsewhere, an entity to be reached by travel or effort. That refers to the ground of existence here, the same ground from which awareness arises and in which the world appears. The sentence that thou art erases the presumed distance between the seeker and the sought. Verse 30. The apparent contradiction between the infinite and the individual is resolved by distinguishing primary meaning from implied meaning. In ordinary usage, the word thou implies a limited individual defined by a particular body and history. When we understand it by implied meaning, when we look past what the word points to on the surface and follow it to what it ultimately indicates, we arrive at pure awareness. The sentence then becomes a statement of identity between pure awareness and the ground of all being. Now the text shifts its attention toward practice, toward the conditions that make this recognition stable and the methods that support the inquiry. If the first half of the work has been a philosophical cartography, the second half is something more like a handbook for the journey. Verse 31. The qualified seeker is characterized by 4 attainments. The first is the discrimination between the eternal and the non-eternal, the capacity to distinguish what persists from what merely appears and dissolves. Verse 32. The second is dispassion, the waning of desire for the enjoyments of this world and of any world that is promised in return for merit. This is not a forced renunciation, but a natural loosening of the grip of things when they are seen clearly for what they are. Verse 33. The third is the sixfold inner discipline, tranquility of mind, restraint of the senses, withdrawal from activity that feeds distraction, forbearance in the face of difficulty, faith in the teacher and the teachings, and the one-pointed focusing of the mind. Verse 34. The fourth is the longing for liberation, mumukshutva, the burning wish to be free. This is not merely an intellectual preference for the Advaita view over competing philosophical positions. It is an orientation of the whole being, in which everything else has become secondary to the single question of what one actually is. Verse 35. The means of knowledge are 3, hearing the teaching from a qualified teacher, Shravana, reflecting on what has been heard until all doubt is resolved, Manana, and sustained, unbroken meditation on the truth that has been heard and reflected upon, Nididhyasana. These 3 are not stages to be completed in sequence and then left behind. They interpenetrate and reinforce each other throughout the life of the practitioner. Verse 36. Shravana removes the doubt that arises from never having heard the truth stated directly. Manana removes the doubt that arises from having heard it but not having thought it through. Nididhyasana removes the residual sense of separation that persists even after the intellect has been thoroughly convinced, the deep habit of identifying with the limited self that does not yield to argument alone, but requires sustained counter-pressure. Verse 37. Just as a person who has been told there is no snake in a dark rope still feels a momentary contraction when the rope is encountered again in poor light, so the practitioner who has understood the teaching intellectually may still find old patterns of identification arising in challenging circumstances. Nididhyasana is the practice that gradually wears down this residual reactivity until the recognition becomes the stable ground of ordinary experience. Verse 38. The practice of Nididhyasana takes the form of sustained resting in the awareness that I am Brahman, Aham Brahmasmi. This is not an affirmation designed to replace one false self-concept with a more elevated one. It is a return, again and again, to the awareness that is already present, staying there rather than following the habitual movement outward toward objects. Now the text turns to samadhi, the states of absorption that arise in advanced practice and their relationship to the liberation that is the goal. Verse 39. Samadhi is of 2 types, savikalpa, which retains some degree of mental modification, and nirvikalpa, which is entirely free of mental modification. Both are forms of absorption, but they differ in depth and in what they leave behind. Verse 40. Savikalpa Samadhi itself takes three forms. In the first, the mind is absorbed in a gross object, a physical form, an image, a bodily sensation held in sustained attention. In the second, the mind is absorbed in a subtle object, a mantra, a vital force, an internal luminosity. In the third, the mind rests in the thought current of I am Brahman, the verbal or conceptual recognition of identity, without yet being free of the movement of that recognition itself. Verse 41. Just as fire burns the fuel that feeds it and is then extinguished when the fuel is consumed, so the sustained practice of I am Brahman gradually burns away the ignorance that has obscured the self, and when that ignorance is fully consumed, the practice itself falls away. It is a raft, not a destination. Verse 42. In Nirvikalpa Samadhi, the distinction between knower, knowing, and known dissolves entirely. There is no experiencer standing apart from experience, no object being known, no act of knowing bridging a gap between them. The triad that structures ordinary consciousness is temporarily absent. What remains is pure awareness, not aware of anything, not aware of nothing, simply awake as itself. Verse 43. In deep sleep, the mind merges temporarily into the causal body, into the undifferentiated seed state from which it arose. In Nirvikalpa Samadhi, the mind is not merely dormant, but is resolved into the self by the power of knowledge. This is the important distinction. In sleep, ignorance persists, and the individual wakes again as the same limited self. In samadhi supported by knowledge, what was obscuring the self is being worn away. Verse 44. The practice of samadhi and the practice of inquiry are not opposed. They support each other. Samadhi steadies the mind so that inquiry can proceed without distraction. Inquiry ensures that the stillness of samadhi is understood correctly, as a glimpse of what one always is, not as a special state to be alternately entered and left. Verse 45. The Atman, ever pure, ever free, ever luminous, was never actually bound. Bondage is the appearance that arises within the Atman when the Atman, as it were, overlooks itself and takes its own reflections to be external realities. Liberation is the ending of this oversight. It is not a journey from here to there. It is the recognition that the distance was always imaginary. Verse 46. One who abides in this recognition is free, not free from the world, but free within it, as the sky is free within the weather that passes through it. Such a one sees and acts and speaks and moves in the world, but is not defined or bound by any of it. The witness remains. What is witnessed passes. This has always been so, knowing that it has always been so not as a belief, but as a living recognition. This is what the Drg-Drishya Viveka calls liberation.